And class is in session. You're listening to Shit Shooting 101. I'm your host, Joshua Lee. Joining us today, club and radio DJ, author of The Cause and the Cure, and the 3-volume series Musical Truth, host of the Good Vibrations podcast. He's crossfading us out of the loop of lies and into a higher frequency, hitting the kill switch on mind control, turning up the volume on moral principle and veracity, here to scratch the record on the end of tyranny and drop the mic in a message of victory over evil. It's Mark Devlin. Mark, welcome to the show.
Hey, brother. Thanks for that very cool intro.
Well, it's been a long time coming, and I finally got you on the show, and it's a great honor. I'm thankful for you to be here.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's taken a minute. We've had a few sort of obstacles to overcome, but we're here now, and let's have a good conversation.
All right. So jumping right into it, one of your key phrases is "no more heroes." That really resonates with me, and it's something that I try to tell people, and they just can't get it in their head. So would you mind explaining what you mean by "no more heroes"?
Sure. Heroes always let you down in the end. Manufactured ones do anyway. So my work of the past, getting on for 15 years now, looking into the true nature of the music industry and how that fits into entertainment generally, and then into every other walk of life, because it's all ultimately connected, has thrown up so many names who have been put on a pedestal by people and revered as heroes. So it might be somebody like, for example, Dr. Timothy Leary, the acid guru from the 1960s, this Harvard professor who espoused the use of LSD and consciousness exploration and stuff like this. And people might think, well, that sounds noble enough. That sounds like a pretty cool guy. But you delve into his background and you don't have to search very far to find that he was up to his neck in CIA connections. So he's not who you thought he was. There's Terence McKenna, who was also a guy that talked about consciousness studies and plant medicine and the use of entheogens and this kind of thing. And he's got a huge fan base. But Jan Irvin of Gnostic Media a few years ago did some digging around in Terence McKenna's past, and he found connections to the FBI. And there's actually a quote from McKenna himself from one of his lectures where he says that he was recruited by the FBI to do some of their bidding. So there goes another hero. And then you get into the world of music, and people will say, oh, well, Jim Morrison was my hero from The Doors. But you look into who his father was, the Navy admiral in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which springboarded America into the Vietnam War. And then you've got some questions about Jim, like, was he complicit? Was he an actor? Was he just playing a role? And it just goes on and on and on. And what I hear all the time as a result of my work is, oh, yeah, we appreciate what you say about the music industry being completely controlled and used for mass mind control, used to push agendas, and we accept that certain bands are obviously doing that. The Beatles were doing it quite clearly, the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, so many other groups. But my band wasn't involved in that. You know, my band slipped through the net. My band was genuine. People might say that about The Clash, perhaps, or The Jam, or somebody like that. But when you do the research and when you accept that the entire industry is controlled and is used to push certain social engineering agendas, it actually becomes a ridiculous proposition to claim that any one group or any one artist somehow slipped through the net and somehow was allowed to express themselves in a genuine and sincere way without being controlled by overlords and handlers. So the reason I use the phrase "no more heroes" is because anyone in the public eye, anyone who's famous, any kind of household name, anyone that everyone's heard of has been placed there, because you don't get a career like that off your own back. It's served up to you by those groups, those parties that can make this kind of thing happen. So we've all been burned. We've all had heroes. I certainly have. I'm a club and radio DJ or former DJ, as you said in the intro. And I used to look up to other DJs. They were my heroes. There were certain names that I used to revere. And I now look at them and how they got their careers and how they got successful. And I can see that it's no different to what happens with singers and bands and stuff. So I've had to let all my DJ heroes go. And so the only way to avoid getting burnt and being mugged off is to adopt the mantra, no more heroes. You've got to be your own hero.
I say hell yeah to that. Before we get to the conversation on the two Paul McCartneys, I'd like to go back to the 50s, the man who both John and Paul idolized themselves, Elvis Presley. Now, Elvis, he was born a twin, and his twin died shortly after birth. And I propose the possibility, or I should say the outright speculation that hypothetical, what if that twin didn't die? Because I look at, it would explain, why there was another Elvis that was seen after death. And if you compare Elvis's earlier stuff like Jailhouse Rock to, say, the 60s stuff of like Heartbreak Hotel, those are two distinctly different vocalizations. They don't even sound like the same person at all. And so my what if is what if they weren't the same person? What would you think about that question?
Well, it's not impossible. And I've come to realize that very little is in this world in which we find ourselves. I know that the researcher known as Miles Mathis put out a paper many years ago where he was hypothesizing that Elvis Presley may be one of twins. And what we're seeing is the twins paging in and out of the role. And his idea that instead of having Elvis Aaron Presley, there was Elvis and Aaron Presley, his brother. So yes, it's not impossible, and it would explain a few things. I don't agree with everything that Miles Mathis puts out. I doubt that he's very much of a fan of my work. But some of the stuff that he's put out has resonated with me. Certainly not all of it, but that's a possibility. And there's probably other researchers that would go along those lines as well. Elvis is an interesting character to study. He was the first rock and roll superstar, of course, and it started a very familiar routine of white artists being used to sell black music. So we had the same thing effectively with the Beatles and all these British bands like the Rolling Stones, and then the groups that Eric Clapton was involved with, and so many other groups. What they were basically doing was taking American black rhythm and blues music and repackaging it for a mainstream white audience and then selling it to them. So you can understand why many black artists who'd perfected those styles and developed them would have been very pissed off at all these mainstream artists taking what they created and pushing it out there for the mass market. So that's what Elvis Presley was doing. He of course had a handler, and it would appear to be this guy Colonel Tom Parker, who was not a real military colonel. It was just a title that was affectionately bestowed on him. There was the movie last year directed by Baz Luhrmann, simply called Elvis, where Tom Hanks played the role of Colonel Tom Parker. Did a terrible job, in my view, terrible attempt at a Dutch accent, because Colonel Tom Parker was a Dutchman who popped up in the United States with a very dubious background and lots of unanswered questions, and very quickly became close to Elvis Presley to the point that he basically controlled his every move. That's a classic mind control subject handler relationship. So I think Elvis himself was definitely mind controlled. Most major artists are. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he was working for various intelligence agencies during his entertainment career. And this has happened many times in history, where those who are able to travel around the world freely under the guise of being an entertainer, whether it's a singer or a sort of magician like Harry Houdini, for example, who was on the payroll of the CIA. He was basically a spy, but he was able to travel freely under the guise of being an entertainer. This is a great way of them gathering information and reporting back to their masters. So there's a lot of research to suggest or confirm that Elvis Presley had connections to some of these agencies. And then there's the strange circumstances surrounding his reported death. So we're told that he died on the 16th of August, 1977. 16th of August is a very unlucky date for musicians, because that's the date that Robert Johnson died way back in the 30s, and he was known as the King of Blues. It's the day that Aretha Franklin died in, I think it was 2017, and she was known as the Queen of Soul. And it's also the day that Elvis Presley is said to have died, and he was known as the King of Rock and Roll. And the 16th of August also happens to be Madonna's birthday, just as a matter of interest. But I don't buy that Elvis checked out in 1977, as we're told he did, on the bog, just keeled over and died at the age of 42. I think it's far more likely that, given his connections to intel agencies, he was allowed to be retired out of public life, out of the spotlight, and live out his remaining years, under a different identity in a sort of witness protection program type scenario. I believe that happens with certain artists. I think that was probably the case with Jim Morrison, given who his dad was and given some of his connections. I don't subscribe to the view that that's what happens with all artists. I think that when we're told certain artists have died, they really have. Jimi Hendrix would be an example, Janis Joplin also, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. But I think there is a provision made for certain assets. If they've done a good job, if they've served, their industry masters, a provision is made for them to retire out of the public spotlight. And it's my personal view, I can't prove it, but it's my personal view that that's what happened with Elvis Presley.
Okay, so moving on to the two Paul McCartneys. When I dove into this, and I'm no seasoned veteran when it comes to the Paul is dead conspiracy, but when I looked into it, you immediately become obsessed. And one of the first things I did, just to convince myself one way or another whether there even were two Pauls, was I just wanted to go through all the photo catalogs. And I just first started off, I picked a random year. I figured I'll look at 1964, the first year they came to America, the Beatles, I should say. And looking through those photographs, I was instantly convinced that, yes, there were two Pauls going back that far. And I'm no forensic specialist, so without even looking at the facial structure, the jawline, the ears, and all that, I was looking at the height of this one particular guy who was much taller than the other Paul. And I know a lot of people will say, well, they went back and photoshopped in the new Paul to make it seem as if he was the same as the old Paul, like he was always around. But the thing is, if they would have photoshopped him in, I would have assumed that they would have cropped him to make him seem the right height. But what they were doing in a lot of these photographs, I noticed, where they were positioning him in ways to try to disguise his lankiness and his height. He would either be sitting down while the rest of the Beatles were standing up, or he would have a leg up and leaning in, or he would be in the background while the rest of the Beatles were in the foreground. So what do you think about that, the possibility of there have always been two Pauls in the band?
Well, I've been all over the place when it comes to researching this McCartney conspiracy. And that's not down to any kind of sloppy research. It's actually the contrary. The more research you do into this, the more muddy the waters become. That's certainly been my experience. So you would think that if you put in hours and hours and hours of research, as I did in the early days, when I first started researching the music industry, the true nature of it, I very quickly came across the Paul is dead conspiracy. And as you say, it can be an obsessive thing. I spent hours and hours looking at it, more than is healthy, and just absorbed so much information. And I found that the more information you take on, the more confusing it gets, because this is very far from a clear-cut and simple affair. Just going back to Miles Mathis again, in his paper on McCartney, he contends the same thing as with Elvis Presley. So he says that Paul McCartney was one of twins, and what we're seeing is the two twins paging in and out of the role. So I don't really go for that one. I started off accepting the conventional conspiracy theory, to call it that the real Paul McCartney died in 1966. So the date given for it is 9/11, September 11th in American date format, or in British date format, that would be the 9th of November. But either way, we keep hearing that it's 1966. And according to this myth, this legend, there was a replacement that was brought in to replace McCartney in his public appearances and his role within the Beatles from late 1966 onwards. And it was this individual who was responsible for the Sgt. Pepper's album, the classic game-changing Beatles album, and all their creative output from that point on. So this is the basis of the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, and there's an alternative version of that called Bill is Back. And these books were put out there by a guy named Thomas E. U. Harriot, who is described as an encoder as well as an author. And these books purport to be the autobiography of the individual who's been playing the role of Paul McCartney publicly since 1966. So it's supposed to be a guy by the name of William Shepherd or William Campbell, depending on which version you look at. And it's from the William Shepherd name that we get the nickname Billy Shears, hence the Memoirs of Billy Shears, and hence the lyric in the Beatles Sgt. Pepper album, where in the opening track they say, "So may I introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears." That was supposed to be his first public presentation to the world. So I went along with that one for quite a while. And there are a number of clues that have been placed in Beatles artwork, particularly the Sgt. Pepper cover and the Abbey Road cover. There's certain clues that have been placed in lyrics, in songs. There are backmasked messages that only can be discerned when you play the recording backwards. And a lot of this stuff points towards the idea of McCartney dying and being replaced. But then I started to get correspondence from various people pointing out anomalies, discrepancies, and pointing out that we don't seem to have had just one individual playing the role of Paul McCartney since 1966. Sometimes we see the one that seems to be a bit shorter. Sometimes we see one that has a more rounded face, a fatter face. Sometimes we see the one that's taller with a more elongated face. And it becomes virtually impossible to discern when you look at the photo evidence, the video evidence. So the only thing I can say with any certainty now at this point in the game is that there have definitely been more than one Paul McCartney. It's not the case that there's just been this one guy playing the role. There's definitely been two. But does that mean anyone died in 1966? Well, it doesn't prove it. So that whole ritual could well be just that, given that the industry is controlled by dark occultists and they do adhere to certain ritualistic practices in line with their belief systems. So we've had more than one Paul McCartney, but it's quite possible that these two characters have been pitching in and out of the role all along. And, you know, it's not just since 1966 that this has all happened. it's been throughout the Beatles' career and all the way up to present day. It's about as clear as a bucket of tar, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, so where do I go from there? There's so much to touch upon. It's the 60s, such a weird, strange time period. You have 1962 when the Illuminati declares war on Christianity. 1963, the very next year, JFK is shot, and that may have been theatrics as far as I'm concerned. Then 1964, the Beatles come to America. 1966, just 2 years later, that's the year that is declared first year, year one, year of by Anton LaVey and echoed in the movie Rosemary's Baby. And Rosemary's Baby, it tells you that everything that is mainstream media is some sort of satanic theatrics. And so it seems to me that the Paul is Dead ritual was a lot of theatrics, a lot of subconscious theatrics, but that's even more powerful when you're talking about mind control and all of that. And then you have the death of John Lennon, which was portrayed in that movie, as many have pointed out. And it's the more you look into it, the more blatant it is that they're pointing it out. And even the what's his name, Ira Levin, the author of the book Rosemary's Baby, later on, I think he was a bit senile at the point that he wrote. I can't remember the follow-up to Rosemary's Baby, but he was even mentioning
He wrote
John
The Boys
Lennon.
from Brazil, didn't he?
Is that what it was called?
Well, that was one of his stories about the Nazi hunter with Gregory Peck playing Dr. Joseph Mengele. That was an Era 11 story.
Oh no, his follow-up to Rosemary's Baby, it's set in it's set in New York, and it talks about Rosemary in present time, which at that time I believe would have been the 90s. And it turned out that she was actually, I don't know, the whole story didn't make sense. I never read the book, I just read the
Right. Yeah, I heard about that, but I've not read that myself either.
Yeah, it was all over the place. But anyways, getting back to Thomas E.U. Harriot, that's an anagram for I am three authors, which makes me beg the question, what if those three authors are also the three Beatles that are on George Martin's family crest? The two Pauls, or Paul, William Shepard, and John Lennon. What if all three were actually still alive and part of that book?
Yeah, well, I didn't realize that Thomas E.U. Harriot was an anagram of I am three authors. So some great work there. That's something to ponder on. We don't really know if he really exists. I've had some email correspondence with someone who purports to be Thomas E.U. Harriot, but can we be sure that he's real? Can we be sure that Miles Mathis is real? People are asking that about William Shakespeare. Maybe William Shakespeare was a consortium of writers rather than one individual. Maybe we get a lot of that. The 60s, yeah, it was a decade that definitely changed culture forever. I've mentioned a few times that when I was a lot younger, my dad always used to say, I blame the 60s for this. Like there'd be some blatant sex or violence on TV, or there'd be a story about teenage girls getting pregnant. And he would say, oh, it's all because of the 60s. And he was actually right, because that decade was used to change societal attitudes forever. We had new ways of thinking about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and family relationships, and the birth control pill, civil rights, activist sort of, causes. All of that happened in that decade. And there were some pretty dark events as well. There was, as you say, Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan declaring the 1st of May 1966 to be year one, Anno Satanus, year of Satan. You had events like the Rolling Stones at Altamont, where 5 people died. You had, in Britain, we had stuff going on. So you had the Cray twins, who were these notorious gangsters from the East End of London who ruled the city with terror and ended up going down for murder. There was the Moors murders, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, who killed a bunch of children. So that stuff was going on this side of the pond. And then back in America, you had the assassination of JFK, assassination of RFK, assassination of Martin Luther King, assassination of Malcolm X. So it's a very dark decade in many ways. And it has so much to answer for in terms of the ripples of it still being felt now. Actually, I know this show is becoming like a sort of commercial for other hosts and other podcasts, but I just want to shout out the great work of Crow 777, who's done some really good deep dives into social engineering aspects of the 1960s, along with Jason Lindgren. Those guys have really looked at how the change in attitudes and perceptions, all at the hands of social engineers, psychologists, behavioral scientists, who know how to manipulate the human psyche. They know how we think. They know how to coerce us into certain behaviors and belief systems. And so much of that was done in the 1960s. The Beatles played their part in that. They were a group that was used to socially engineer the young people at the time, as so many other groups were. The Grateful Dead is an obvious band from the US that was used for that, and there's so much of it. So don't know where you want to go from there, but there's a lot there.
Two of the things about the Beatles that really disturbed me, even when I was a teenager, before I heard about the Paul is dead conspiracy or knew anything about the 60s or anything like that, because I grew up without internet and I didn't have cable. So there were a lot of things I was unaware of. If it wasn't in your local bookstore, I didn't know about it. So it was innocent times for me. So I was just able to enjoy the music for the surface value of it. But even at that, there were a couple things that disturbed me. And one of them was the Magical Mystery Tour movie. I still can't watch it to this day. It's very, like I said, disturbing. I can't think of another word.
Yeah, I hate it.
And the other one is Revolution Number 9. And I don't know. I can't think of any other reason why they would plant that in the White Album other than the fact that it's some sort of MK Ultra mind control programming of some sort, because it's very disorienting, and to the point that if you're on LSD listening to that, I imagine it would cause a split in personality. It would be just sheer paranoia. I try to listen to it sober just to try to wrap my head around it, and I'm feeling disoriented and like I'm losing my mind. And a love and peace hippie band shouldn't want to drive their fans to psychosis like that. It's very odd. What are your views on that, the MK Ultra aspects of the Beatles?
Yeah, well, they expressed themselves very obviously in a number of ways. There were two very distinct phases to the Beatles. When they first emerged as a straight rock and roll band, they were putting out effectively love songs. She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, all of that. And that's how they built their fan base early on. When they first burst onto the scene with Love Me Do in 1962, people loved them, young people loved them, because it was catchy songs, nice, pleasant songs. Girls liked them because they fancied them. and the tunes were family friendly and your mum liked them and all that sort of stuff. But then in 1966, things started to change. So interestingly, that's the year that Anton LaVey declared as, year one, the year of Satan. It's the year that Paul McCartney is said to have died in this ritualistic car crash. And it's the year that the Beatles' music and their entire look and their entire ethos started to change. So you had the track Tomorrow Never Knows, which was a real game changer. And that was based on Timothy Leary's interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So it was Eastern mysticism starting to creep into the Beatles' music. And also the production techniques were changing as well, becoming much more elaborate at the hands of George Martin. So you listen to that track and there's all kinds of audio effects on it. And it's very strange, it's very psychedelic, it's very way out, and it's very different to I Want to Hold Your Hand. So the strategy with the Beatles is the same as they do with so many acts. They build the fan base, they get them to love the act, and then at a given time, when it's judged appropriate, they do a switch on them, and they become a different kind of act. But because the fan base is already there, and has been swept along with them, and they've decided that they trust and they like these people, they'll go along with whatever they say and, will go in whatever direction they're coerced to go in. So the Beatles started to embrace psychedelic culture as the counterculture came in 1966, 67, in preparation for the Summer of Love. And isn't it interesting also that right about the time that we're told Paul McCartney died, the Beatles stopped playing live. So their last live performance was, I think it was the 29th of August, 1966 in Candlestick Park, San Francisco. So from that point on, they became a studio band and their productions became more and more elaborate. And all that fans had was the albums and the singles that were being put out, because it wasn't as if you could go and see them live anymore. And so from Sgt. Pepper onwards, you had this very experimental music. Sgt. Pepper is lauded as a classic album, and so many people say it's the best album ever put out there. I actually don't like it personally. I mean, there's a couple of songs. I really like the sort of trippy songs. I like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and I like A Day in the Life, but I really don't like the rest of the album. I mean, when I'm 64, really? Come on, what kind of song is that? That's not even psychedelic, and yet it's in the middle of a sort of psychedelic album released in that era. So then you have Magical Mystery Tour at the end of 67. And as you say, that came with a movie. It was the soundtrack to this movie. And I don't like watching it either. I find it very disturbing. It's like a bad acid trip. Not that I've ever had one, but it's what I can imagine one being like. It makes absolutely no sense. Don't try and discern any kind of meaning, because all it is a mishmash of images and scenes, and it's shite, basically. And it was released to the UK public on Boxing Day, 26th of December, 1967. So just imagine, you've got families sitting around Boxing Day night, they're all stuffed full of turkey sandwiches, and they're eating all the rest of the Christmas leftovers. What's on TV tonight? Oh, the Beatles are on a film. Oh, let's watch that. Grandma's there, aunt is there. What the hell did they make of that movie when that was aired on TV for the first time? Just totally insane. So by that point, it had become obvious that the Beatles were being manipulated by other forces, and they were being told what sort of stuff to put out. Then they became a bit more sort of sensible with the Abbey Road album and the Let It Be album, which weren't as trippy and sort of experimental. But then as the 60s wraps up, so do the Beatles. So they were very much a product of the 1960s. So by 1970, they were done. The job was done. And also, nails had been put in the coffin of the whole hippie counterculture era, helped by the so-called Manson Tate murders, which gave the American public the impression that hippies or anyone that went against the establishment i.e. Manson and his disciples, were murderous, psychopathic lunatics. So we shouldn't tolerate these hippies anymore. Then you had the unfortunate event at Altamont with the Rolling Stones right at the end of the 60s, December 1969. And that was it, really. You know, hippie counterculture, the scene was done because the social engineers felt that the agendas had been fulfilled. And then it was time to move on to the next phase in the 1970s and all the stuff that they wanted to push there.
Yeah, the Manson murders was another thing that was very theatrical and very scripted. It was it read like some sort of bad playwright, and the fact that the White Album is linked to that, it's telling you that the Rosemary's Baby, the Beatles, Manson murders, all these things that are happening in the 60s are all tied together under some sort of literary genius who's writing it all as a script, as I said. That's what it seems to me anyways. And the White Album, it being tied to Manson, makes sense to me because the songs that he said that they say he was influenced by doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But there are weird songs on there that aren't very Beatle-esque, like Happiness is a Warm Gun. So there's violence all throughout this album. Bungalow Bill, who the hell is Bungalow Bill? It's written like a children's song, but he's killing. There's killing in there, violence. And then there's what's the song where John Lennon is singing? He's singing "I Want to Die." I'm so lonely, want to die. And then there's the song that Ringo Starr sings where he's singing, "You were in a car crash and you lost your hair." There's a lot of weird things flowing throughout that album that if you listen to it in whole on some sort of psychedelic, I can see it driving you to madness. Not that I believe that actually is what happened with Manson, but I can see it driving people to madness. And it seems like there's some sort of imprint they're doing on the subconscious of the people in the 60s through albums like that. Yeah. Would you agree?
Well, I would, yeah. And you mentioned earlier the track Revolution Number 9, which is on the White Album. And it's not really music at all. It's just a mishmash of sound effects and conversation, dialogue. And as you say, I can imagine somebody tripping on acid and listening to that track is going to go to some very strange places. There was a lot of that around in the 60s. You had Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, released in 1968, same year as Rosemary's Baby, same year as the White Album. And I remember hearing stories about hippies who would go along to the cinema to watch this newly released film, 2001. And when you get to the Stargate sequence at the end, where you've got all these amazing colors and the David Bowman character is going through this sort of consciousness journey, I can imagine that would absolutely blow your mind if you're tripping on acid. So it seems a lot of these popular culture vehicles were created in line with what was being done societally, culturally. A lot of that was MK Ultra, this very far-reaching mind control program from the CIA. It had lots of different facets. One of them involved the creation of Manchurian Candidate-style assassins. And that movie, The Manchurian Candidate, the original from 1962, starring Frank Sinatra, is telling you how this gets done. They show you the techniques used to create someone who is able to dissociate from reality and go into an alternate persona and commit a murder, but then be triggered to forget all about it. So they've got no conscious memory of what they've done. And that is what was attributed to Mark Chapman, who's said to have shot John Lennon. It's what is said to have happened with Sirhan Sirhan, who assassinated Robert Kennedy. And there are many other examples as well. Then another facet of MK Ultra is where you have mind-controlled entertainers. And this often happens from early childhood, where they're subjected to horrific trauma. It's referred to as trauma-based mind control, and it's very closely linked to satanic ritual abuse, which unfortunately goes on throughout the entertainment industry. So many famous Hollywood actors, many famous musicians, many famous people generally will have unfortunately undergone this. And then there's societal MK Ultra, which is where they're trying to influence all of society and get them to think in certain ways and adopt certain belief systems. And they do that through music, they do it through movies, they do it through people like Timothy Leary espousing LSD, people like Gloria Steinem, who is said to be the sort of inventor of the modern feminist movement. But when you get into her background, you find that she's got ties to the CIA as well. So she's basically on the payroll, and she's creating these new attitudes towards the birth control pill and women going out into the workplace, getting them out of the home, getting them away from those nurturing motherly instincts that women have. It's breaking up the family unit. That's what all these agendas have been about. They want young people completely at odds with the value system of their parents' generation. That's what the 60s were all about. They created the counterculture scene to turn the baby boomers of the time, young people in their 20s, against the more traditional value systems of their parents. I mean, look at Jim Morrison again as an example. Jim's representing that boomer generation, and he's a hero and an icon and a poster child for 60s attitudes. And yet his dad is the old school guard who's going out there starting wars in foreign nations. So you couldn't get more of an opposition going on there. And they've been doing that forever. So that's MK Ultra in its widest sense. And I can't remember what else you asked me. Sorry.
No, I think you covered everything that I asked. You mentioned A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's movie. Of course, it's 2001. We all know what happened in 2001 that was earth-shattering. And Arthur C. Clarke, the one who wrote the book, he very clearly had a lot of inside knowledge. He also had another book called Final Odyssey 3001, so the 1,000-year anniversary of 2001. And I just read a book of his called Childhood's End, and it seems to be pointing towards Project Bluebeam. And in that book, it even mentions, it's talking about the 21st century, and it mentions one world government, one world constitution. So, you know, as far back as then, that was written in 53, I think, at sometime in the 50s. And even back as far back as then, these people on the inside knew what was going to be happening in our time period now, and they were telling us, and not as a warning, but you know, as that revelation of the method, that satanic thing that they think protects their karma, which I don't believe it does, but they do. And so that's what we get a lot when we look backwards in time, those warnings we should have heeded, but we never did, and here we are now. And speaking of where we are now, we still have these characters from the 60s who are lingering around and disappointing people, which goes back to your No More Heroes. One of those is Roger Waters. You know, there was a time period where I was like, well, he's speaking out on the Palestinian thing there, so that's good. He's speaking against the UN and the guys in the white helmets, and so that's all good. Maybe he is on our side. And then, of course, this bug rolls around, and you know, he starts praising Fauci and Gates, and so now I have to look at.
You saw that video, right?
Yeah, I did, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so, you know, Pink Floyd was one of my favorite bands. And at this point, it's not crushing to me or anything like that. But, you know, I have to look at them in a different light. And so what to you was Pink Floyd? Were they were they just more change agents?
Yeah, they were. And I've got in the back of my mind this idea that I want to start a series which is going to be titled Dark Occult Aspects of. Well, I've already started it actually. I've done live presentations titled Dark Occult Aspects of the Beatles, one on the Rolling Stones, one on Prince, and one on Madonna. No shortage of material there, I tell you. And I've just got in mind that it would be really interesting to go through a bunch of bands and just do a deep dive into each of them. So I want to do Queen because there's a lot to discover about Queen, the death of Freddie Mercury, not least, and the controlling aspect that Brian May seems to have over that band. He always seems to have been the real driving force behind Queen, and he's been very handsomely rewarded for it with a sirhood, you know. And then Pink Floyd would be another group it would be very interesting to do. It's just a case of finding the time to do all this, because I've usually got about 1,000,001 projects on the go at any time. But Pink Floyd would be a very fascinating band to look into. So they also had two phases, actually, like the Beatles. Their first phase was very short-lived. So they first came on the scene in the mid-1960s, and they started out being the house band, effectively, for the psychedelic counterculture scene in London. So they initially came out of Cambridge. Syd Barrett, the original frontman, his father was connected with work involving Cambridge University. So for American listeners, Oxford and Cambridge are the two main universities in the UK, a bit like Harvard and Yale. And they're the places where all the so-called elite establishment assets go to get their indoctrination and their system training. Oxford's the main one. That's where they send all the future prime ministers and future business leaders. Osama bin Laden studied at Oxford University. Bill Clinton studied at Oxford University. But you've also got Cambridge. And so Pink Floyd came out of Cambridge, but they were connected with the London counterculture scene. And that in turn was connected with the avant-garde art scene in London. And the Beatles got pulled into that whole thing. You know, they were involved in the Indica Gallery, which was this sort of alternative bookstore and art gallery in the Mayfair area of London. And Paul McCartney was one of the curators of this, if it was really him, along with Peter Asher, who was the brother of Jane Asher, his girlfriend, and a guy called Barry Miles and a guy called John Dunbar. And the avant-garde art scene was all about turning people's concept of art, what constitutes art, on its head, and being all about expression, just expressing yourself freely and shaking off all kinds of convention. So that's actually what the Beatles track Revolution Number 9 was all about. That's why you've got this crazy mishmash of sounds and samples, because it was avant-garde. And the same thing applies to that very controversial album sleeve that the Beatles put out for that album Yesterday and Today in 1966. June, actually, of 66. So it was 666. But you got the Beatles there in butcher's smocks, and they're covered in bits of raw meat. And they've got baby dolls with decapitated heads and mutilated limbs. So what the hell was that all about? Seems to be some very dark, occult, satanic signaling going on there. But we were told it was an avant-garde art statement. They were just trying to push the envelope, be a bit edgy, and redefine people's concepts of art. So that's what they were involved with there. Sorry, I keep going off at tangents and then I forget what you initially asked me. So just remind me again.
Roger Waters and what
Roger
Pink
Waters,
Floyd
right.
really
got
was
you.
about.
Okay, I'm back on track. So Pink Floyd, when they first emerged, were a sort of psychedelic band. And when you listen to their early songs like See Emily Play, these were songs that were written by Syd Barrett, the original songwriter. But Syd very early on in the group's career, went off track, and we're told that he'd done too much LSD, and it had a really bad effect on him to the point that he could no longer function. So he couldn't write songs and he couldn't perform in the band, and he started behaving very erratically. So one explanation for that is that, yeah, he did too much acid, but there's other explanations. And his father was involved in mind control research for Cambridge University. And it's well known that the offspring of individuals connected to the military industrial complex are used as experimental test subjects from time to time. So what if, again, this is me just postulating, but what if Syd Barrett's father, as part of his mind control research, was doing experiments on his son using LSD, and it went really badly to the point that Syd had to be kicked out of the group very early on. So by 1967, Dave Gilmour had come in as his replacement, and then the group's sound began to change towards the end of the 60s, and they moved away from this trippy sort of acid-laden psychedelic sound and started adopting the progressive rock sound for which they're best known, at the hands largely of Dave Gilmour. So you've got the classic album Dark Side of the Moon, incredible album, but the music is very different to how Floyd started out. So it's my view that they are a group that was used for social engineering, just like all the others. And in the 60s, when they first emerged, it suited the controllers to have them pushing this LSD psychedelic culture. But then, as I say, that all seemed to end as the 60s bowed out and the 70s came in. And then Pink Floyd's role changed, as did their music. And often, these artists stay silent in terms of speaking out about stuff for decades. They just keep their heads down, keep churning out the albums, keep going on tour, and they don't say a whole lot. But every now and again they do. And as you say, Roger Waters has been very outspoken about the situation involving Israel and Palestine. And many truth seekers have felt that he is a guy that we've got on our side because he's saying things that other celebrities don't, and it causes them to trust him. But as you say, during the COVID madness, Roger did an interview where he was praising Dr. Anthony Fauci as a great guy. And he also mentioned Bill Gates as a good person. So if you're someone who's capable of doing research into the true nature of the relationship between the Zionist state of Israel and its Palestinian neighbor, to the point that you can go on panels at the United Nations to discuss such matters, you're capable of doing research into the true nature of Dr. Anthony Fauci. And it would only take you about 30 seconds to discover that he's very far from a hero who has humanity's best interests at heart. Same thing with Bill Gates. 30 seconds research into what he's all about. A eugenicist, a psychopath. That's what he is. He's not a hero. He's not some nerdy, geeky computer guy who invented Microsoft. And he's this philanthropic billionaire that gives away loads of his money because he's just got a big heart and he cares. You know, it's just nonsense. So Roger Waters must know this. So then if he comes out with a statement like that, how can you trust him from that point forward? How can you trust any of them? And what often happens is these assets get called upon when an agenda needs propping up. So they're like sleeper agents. You know, some of these Hollywood films you see where you've got sort of Russian spies embedded into American society. A great movie for that was called Telephone, which came out in 1977, starring Charles Bronson and Lee Remick. And it's all about MK Ultra mind control and Manchurian candidate assassins. So in the plot, there's a bunch of Russian spies who've been embedded into American society in ordinary everyday roles. They've been mind controlled, and when the time is deemed right, they get a telephone call, and on the other end of the line is Donald Pleasance, who's playing the programmer, and he speaks a certain phrase, which is a trigger phrase, and when they hear it, their mind control programming kicks in and they become murderous. They just go out on a killing rampage and blow up American military bases and things like that. So that's sleeper agents. They can spend years or decades getting you to trust them and just sort of blending in and seeming innocent enough. But then an agenda comes along that needs pushing. They get the phone call. They're told, you're making this video, you're going to make this statement, and they can't say no. And haven't we had the best demonstration of that dynamic that we ever could over the past 3 years, where pretty much every celebrity, every single famous person, with very few exceptions, have been on board with the official narrative when it comes to COVID and when it comes to the arms spear agenda, all singing from the same hymn sheet. And what would have happened is the phone would have rang for them one day, or they'd have found an email and it would say, you're going on TV and you're going to say this. And we've seen them all do it, in Britain and America, all on the same page, all pushing the same message. Don't you think, doesn't any reasonable, critically minded, thinking person imagine that there might be the odd alternative opinion? You get what's told to you on the news and by the government. Don't you think it's natural for some people to say, actually, I disagree with that. Actually, I don't think that's the best way to go about it. I feel we should do it this way. But we've had none of that. We've just had unanimous adherence to the official narrative. That's another way that you can know all famous people are controlled and all hero worship has to go.
So one guy who has said things, from what I could tell, consistently that I've agreed with, but I haven't looked into him enough, so I'm not going to, form any concrete opinion on the guy. Noel Gallagher of Oasis. I was wondering what your views on him are.
I don't trust him. I don't trust either of the Gallaghers. Oasis were a manufactured, controlled band. They were signed to Creation Records in the early days. The proprietor of Creation Records, Alan McGee, is an occultist. He's into the works of Aleister Crowley. He's into chaos magic. So that's not the best of starts. And what we've had from the Gallagher brothers is mixed messages. So 1 minute they'll say something that makes you think they're on the side of the people and they're opposing authority. But the next minute they'll do a complete flip-flop, a 180-degree about turn, and confuse the hell out of you. Lots of examples of this. I mean, very early on in their career, Noel Gallagher attended a cocktail party at 10 Downing Street with Tony Blair, the new British Prime Minister of the time. And that was all part of this Cool Britannia psyop that they ran in the mid-90s with groups like Blur and Oasis and Pulp and Supergrass and many others. And the idea was to put forward the notion that Britain, and particularly London, was going through this cultural resurgence, which was very reminiscent of the 60s. You had all these cool new bands and these great new sounds, and Tony Blair had just been voted into office on the 1st of May, which is a significant occult date, in 1997. And part of what they did to try and make Tony Blair palatable to young people was to ally him with people like Noel Gallagher. So the idea was people would say, oh, well, you know, if Tony Blair's hanging out with Noel Gallagher, he's a pretty cool guy. And Blair was saying things like, yeah, I used to be in a band, played a bit of guitar, you know, and he said, I used to smoke a spliff or two. So the idea is young people think, oh, Tony Blair's pretty cool, man. Actually, he was a warmongering psychopath, as we came to discover. Wasn't long before he and his pale village idiot Bush were waging war in Afghanistan and Iraq based on a monumental lie. So he showed his true nature there. But Noel Gallagher was used to usher him into place ready for that role. So that was, you know, a long time ago. And then we get to the COVID era. And from Noel, we got the complaint about being forced to wear a mask when he was traveling on a train. And he was like, bollocks to this, you know, I'm not wearing a face mask. They're fucking stupid. They don't do anything. So you think, oh, yeah, cool. Well done, Noel. Yeah, great. But then a short while later, Noel comes out and says he's had the arm spear, the COVID arm spear, because his doctor said he would be crazy not to. So you're like, well, hang on a minute, Noel. You know, if you think this whole COVID thing is a big psyop and it's all nonsense, why are you now adhering with what they're telling you to do as the solution? Why haven't you researched it and looked into what these things are really all about? So that's him. And then you got Liam, who said a thing or two about, I'm not wearing a mask, or he showed solidarity to this group of students that were objecting to some of the COVID restrictions and stuff. But you can't trust him either, you know. I believe I'm correct in saying that he's on the bill for a concert in aid of Ukraine, which is happening this summer. So he's been called upon to do that. Yeah, because Ukraine needs a bit of help. You know, they've only had a few billion so far out of the rest of the world. It's all about the Ukraine, you know. There's no other war-torn, beleaguered nations in the world. It's only Ukraine. That whole thing is obviously another agenda, and they're rolling out their favorite bands to help prop up that one. So I've never trusted Oasis. I don't trust the Gallagher brothers. They're coming out with conflicting messages all the time. There's no way Oasis would ever have been allowed to have become as successful and as influential as they were if they weren't doing some kind of bidding of the industry controllers. So no, the Gallaghers get thrown out along with everyone else.
So now I feel embarrassed for having said a consistent message that I agreed with. When I haven't really paid attention to Oasis or Noel Gallagher or the other brother, to be quite honest. And when you just follow these conspiracy sites, a lot of times you only get one message, and it seemed consistent to me. So thanks for clearing that up. And indeed, no more heroes.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been mixed messages with them, definitely. Another thing with Liam is there's a photograph of him hanging out with Jimmy Savile, and he's given it the Baphomet horned hand sign. So there's a cult signaling going on. These photographs don't get out there by accident. They're telling you what they're all about. It's like you were saying earlier, placing the truth in plain sight, revelation of the method, their way of believing that they can cheat karmic consequence by putting the emphasis for what they're doing on us and away from them, so that when we don't say, we can see what you plan to do and we're not happy with it, we're not having that at all, not in our name. When that doesn't happen, they feel they can go right ahead and do whatever they want to do. And now they're free of the karmic debt because it's falling on us, because we didn't say no. We basically said, we're okay with it. We don't have a problem with it. So we take the consequentialism and they don't. That's the way they see it. But you said it earlier. I don't feel that's the way it works at all. I feel they've severely misjudged that one. I mean, it's definitely why they do it. I know that's why they do things like predictive programming and putting out documents even which lay out exactly where they want to take society into this new world order nightmare. That's why they do it. But as for whether it works and whether it gets them off the karmic hook, well, they're going to discover on the day they leave this reality and pass over to whatever lies beyond that it doesn't work that way. Wouldn't want to be in their shoes on that day.
No, not at all. So Woodstock 1969, if you watch the videos, it's you'll hear these hippies that are talking about the planes flying overhead, seeding the clouds, and that's what caused the rains to come. So it seems that that was the concert was a whole setup to try to make the hippie movement look bad, but the few organic hippies that existed actually came together in that moment and made it work throughout the weekend. But then you fast forward to Woodstock 1999. I don't know if you've seen the Netflix documentary Trainwreck, but in 1999, it was an absolute disaster. Women were being raped, people were getting beat up, they set the place on fire. It took place on a military base. And so that seemed like a setup as well. So how do you look at the Woodstocks overall, the multiple Woodstocks, I should say?
I don't know much about the 1999 one, so I've not seen that documentary. I know a fair bit about the 1969 one, which came 1 week after the so-called Manson tape murders. So it was like another really bad representation of that hippie flower power generation. So you'd had this murderous rampage of Charles Manson and his disciples, and then you had this festival which seemed very benevolent and very well-meaning in intent, all about peace and love, all about bringing people together to listen to some great music. But there were disastrous elements to it. As you say, it ended up just being a mud fest, and you had all these tens or hundreds of thousands of people rolling around in mud and no toilet facilities, so people are just kind of relieving themselves wherever, and the whole thing just became a disgusting mess. And organizationally it became chaotic as well. And the way it would have been presented in the mainstream news is, look what happens when these dirty long-haired hippies all get together in the name of peace and love. All they end up doing is drugs, rolling around in mud, fornicating, all of this. That's the way it would have been presented to the middle classes, the sort of conservative newspaper, evening news bulletin consuming American public. And that would have all have been by design. Again, Crow 777, who I mentioned earlier, has done some great work looking into Woodstock. He's of the view that it wasn't even a singular event that took place in a singular venue. We're told it took place in a place called Bethel Woods. So it wasn't even Woodstock at all. It was some way from the town of Woodstock. But Crow has looked at footage of it, and he's of the view that it's been patched together, and you've had performances from various different locations, and you've had footage of the crowd that's been sort of spliced in. And so when you see what purports to be a video documentary of the original Woodstock, it's a hodgepodge sort of patchwork quilt of different bits and pieces that have been stitched together. And he makes some very plausible points when you look at his research into this. So I would encourage people to listen to some of the shows that Crow and Jason have done on that. So the original Woodstock would clearly have been a psyop. Unfortunately, pretty much everything in popular culture is, because popular culture doesn't evolve organically the way we're trained to think of it as. So all these fads, these trends, these scenes, these movements, they're created by social engineers working in places like the Tavistock Institute in London and working for military intelligence operations like MI5 in Britain, Cambridge and Oxford universities. And in the States, it's Stanford Research Institute and Harvard and Yale and these sort of places that cook up all these agendas for us. So unfortunately, nothing on the scale of Woodstock is ever going to be allowed to flourish and thrive on its own terms. And in Britain, the closest thing we have to that Woodstock concert happens every year at Glastonbury, round about the time of the summer solstice towards the end of June. You've got this massive event now at Glastonbury, which has been running since 1970. Glastonbury is a very important mystical site in the southwest of England. It's got all kinds of legends attached to it. And it's a very special place, very spiritual place. And it's just the sort of place that the controllers would want to get a hold of and try and harness some of that energy and steer it off in certain desired directions. So the Glastonbury Festival is very occult now in the way that it looks. The main stage is called the Pyramid Stage, for fuck's sake, you know, pretty obvious. And they get people like Sir Paul McCartney to headline and various sirs. And all the obvious bands play there, you know, Oasis have played there, of course, and all the big bands do. And it's all under very controlled circumstances. So Glastonbury is kind of like the UK version of Woodstock, except that it happens every year. And I'm certain that there's a lot of surveillance and monitoring that goes on there. So you're going to find intel agents working on behalf of these institutions that I just mentioned, who are going to be observing what happens when all these young people come together. Because that seems to be a very important element to all these concerts and the hippie gatherings and the communes and stuff back in the 60s. To a very large extent, these were social experiments, and the social engineers just wanted to study what would happen when you would get large numbers of young people coming together, taking drugs, expanding their consciousness or changing their brain chemistry. And on top of that, you've got music with certain frequencies and certain production techniques embedded into the music, vibrational frequencies, and you've got signs, sigils, symbols, and you've got young people dancing in a ceremonial sort of fashion. So I think that's what we've seen a lot of over the decades. In the 60s, you had all these hippie concerts and these communes and stuff. There was drugs, there was music, there was dancing. Then in the late 80s, out of the UK, you had the emergence of the acid house rave scene, which gave birth to the electronic dance music scene of the 1990s and beyond. And in those early acid house raves, which were held in warehouses and then eventually out in the open in fields, you had the same thing. It was music, drugs, dancing. Different kind of music, different kind of drugs, different kind of dancing, but still the same dynamics taking place. And this is down to the recognition that we humans are intrinsically tuned in to music, rhythm, vibration, and dancing. So ancient civilizations all around the world have been into this since probably the dawn of mankind. There was a great quote actually from Moby. Moby, the dance music producer, the techno guy, he's from a Freemasonic family, so he's another one you can't trust. And of course, he's been successful and influential, so you can't trust him for that either. But he did make a very potent comment. Often these people do speak, you know, some very truthful things in among their deceptions. So there was a documentary for the BBC, of all people, a few years ago, into the impact of electronic dance music all around the world. And Moby said something to the effect of, imagine it's 10,000 years ago and a bunch of people are dancing around a fire in a ceremonial fashion while a shaman is tapping out a rhythm on a drum, and the firelight is flickering in the eyes of this ancient tribal civilization. He said, you've just described 10,000 years ago and last night, meaning on the previous night, there would have been millions of young people all over the world dancing together in a ceremonial fashion, coming together in unity, doing drugs probably in many cases, listening to rhythmic music and expressing themselves through dancing, because that's what we're hardwired to do. But the controllers want all of that to happen on their terms. They want to control the music. They want to control the drugs that are consumed. They want to control the environment and the surroundings where all this stuff takes place. That's why they create music festivals. That's why they created the worldwide electronic dance music clubbing scene. That's why they do all of this stuff. These people, if we can refer to them accurately as people, are hell-bent on control. That's all they want. They just want to control the rest of us. As we well know, I'm sure your listeners are aware, but in the so-called elite psychopathic mindset, they see all of us as just dumb, useless eaters to be manipulated, to be controlled. And I feel that has been a major strategic error on their part by assuming all of us. See, this is psychopathy. This is their eugenicist mindset, where they feel that they, the so-called elite class, these aristocratic bloodline families, are the true rulers, rightful rulers of this place, and everybody else who doesn't belong to one of these elite families is just a useless eater, this dumb, lobotomized moron. Now, clearly there are many dumb, lobotomized morons out there, but we're not all like that. There is a significant percentage of us who can think for ourselves and have researched this stuff and know exactly what these psychopathic bastards are up to. That's why we have shows like this. So for them to lump us all in together as useless idiots is a very grave error on their part. And I feel they're going to come to discover that, because our number is growing by the day. That process is only going in one direction, and it's not going to be reversed anytime soon.
Well, I think that's a very beautiful note to end this on, Mark. So any plugs, products, promotions, where can my listeners find you?
Okay, so my hub website, the one-stop shop, is djmarkdevlin.com. And from there, you can go to my videos and my podcasts. So I'm on YouTube, third channel, managing to survive one way or another. I'm on BitChute, I'm on Odyssey, and I'm on Rumble. So you can find all my videos on there. I've got my Good Vibrations podcasts on Spreaker. And on Mixcloud, I have my 2 music shows. So every weekend, I do a show called The Sound of Now, which consists of soulful, uplifting house music, which is the stuff I love to listen to. It really lifts the spirit. So I do a 2-hour showcase of that, and I put that on Mixcloud every Saturday. And then I've got my show, The Sound of Freedom, which is conscious message music by real artists who aren't controlled by corporations, and they're free to express themselves creatively. So I love putting that together. And then I've got my books. I've got my 3 volumes in the Musical Truth series, which has brought together all my research since sort of 2007, 2008, when I first started looking into all of this. That's all in those 3 books. I've got my allegorical novel, The Cause and the Cure, which I put out in 2019. And last week, I started writing the sequel to that. So This one is going to be called The Gift and the Curse. The storyline features many of the same characters from the first book, which was set in the city of Oxford, Illuminati Central, in the early 90s. So it's 1990, 1991. So this story moves forward 10 years. It catches up with many of the same characters. It's September 2001, which was a pretty momentous month. And so the story is based around the events of 9/11 and some of the sort of aftermath of that. And I'm about 3 chapters into writing it. I love the experience of writing fiction. It's very cathartic. It's a great way of getting messages across, because when you write non-fiction, you have to provide citations for everything you say. Otherwise, you make some wild, bold claim, and somebody will say, "You've just pulled that out of your ass. There's no proof for that." And you have to be able to say, "Really? Well, here's the document that I got it from, or here's the interview where that person said that." But with fiction, you don't have to provide citations because it's fiction, right? Except you can embed the story with a whole load of truth bombs. So you can put truth literally into the words of your characters so that the readers are getting that truth. They think it's fiction, but actually you're imparting important messages through the story. So I'm loving that. That's going to be my main project for the rest of the year. And I'm looking to get that book out by the end of the year, plus an audiobook version and plus a soundtrack, because I do soundtracks to my novels. Just like you get with films, I put out a soundtrack with music from the era and little bits of dialogue and stuff like that. So yeah, busy as ever. I love keeping busy. I've always got loads of things on the go, but djmarkdevlin.com is the place to go for all of it.
I'm always interested in the etymology of people's last names. So I went to the old Googler contraption and typed in the name meaning of Devlin, and it says fierce courage. So you bear the mark of courage, and I ask that you stay courageous as long as you can, my friend. And thank you for coming on. This has been great.
Well, thank you, sir. Just to address that, a few people have either written to me or just gone ahead and done a video about it, saying, "He's telling us what he's all about. It's right there in his name. Mark Devlin, it's the mark of the devil. He's got the devil in him." So if they'd only done 2 minutes research into the origin of the last name Devlin, well, first things first, the name only came into my family. Not that it's anyone's business, but I'll tell them anyway. The name only came into my family because my dad was adopted by an Irish fella called Devlin. So my original name wasn't even Devlin. If I'd taken my father's original name, it was something else. Secondly, Devlin is a Gaelic Irish name, and the original spelling of it in Gaelic is Diobhlin, and phonetically it just comes out as Devlin. So it's been anglicized, and the simplest way of expressing it is as it sounds, Devlin, instead of that complicated Gaelic name. So yeah, it's great that that's what it really means in Gaelic. It doesn't mean I've got the devil in me, and anyone who had properly researched the etymology of that name would realize that. So there's a lot of idiots out there spouting nonsense. People have said I'm a Freemason. People have said I'm an MI5 operative with absolutely zero evidence to back it up. Unfortunately, in this game, you get a bit of that, but I appreciate you taking the time to properly research that name, and I appreciate you getting me on the show. Many thanks for the invite.
All right. Thank you, brother. And you take care.
All right. Cheers.
Look, up in the sky. It's a drone. It's chemtrails. It's anything but Superman. There is no white knight upon his valiant steed galloping towards us. There is no princess's kiss that's going to leap the frog from the boiling pot. There is no preacher, politician, celebrity, or talking head waving his cape behind in flight of our rescue. The faceless villains know this, for they supply and control our heroes. They tell us our allies and our enemies who to praise and who to protest, anything to keep us awaiting a savior. Yet this is no Marvel comic book where the villain missteps on cue. This is no John Wayne Western where the new sheriff takes back the town with one quick draw pull of the trigger. There is no savior where we do not save ourselves. No more heroes, and no more playing the damsel in distress. Be unto one another the heroless rescuers of us, for we are the only ones who can save the day, and write into the plot the happy ending as we see fit for our tale of valor, defiance, and ultimate victory over the dark forces of world domination. Be your own heroes for whom we've waited too long. Love, peace, happiness. Signing off. Deuces.